Midweek Murders contains graphic and explicit content. Listener discretion is advised.
Speaking of tone of voice, Niklas, they had like a scheduled Zoom break time at his work, and Niklas was eating birthday cake. And people were like, "Do you have cake, Niklas?" He was like, "Yeah, I have cake every Monday." No reaction. Someone was like, "Is that a joke?" He was like, "Yes, obviously it's a joke. I don't bake cakes every Monday." And they were like, "We can't tell with you because you never change your tone of voice."
Understandable.
The thing is with both me and Niklas is that people can't tell when we're being sarcastic.
You need to watch the Harry Potter movies more and just channel your inner Snape. His obviously line is pretty obviously riddled with Snape.
So what you're trying to say is that I should always end my sarcastic sentences with obviously.
Yeah, but maybe work on your Snape impression and less of your Bane impression.
Okay, so it's Wednesday, which means that it's time to talk about crime. You are listening to Midweek Murders, and I'm your host, Sandra.
And I am your host, Sandra.
No! I was so proud of me getting through that, and then you ruined it.
And I'm your host, Joe.
This week we're going to talk about the murder of Courtney Valentine-Brown. My sources were an article in Essex Live News by Hope Woolston, an article on the Crown Prosecution Service, and an article on iNews by Deepika Roshani.
My source was a 3-part documentary called Murder 24/7 on the BBC.
Oh, that's it.
That's it, yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, that was 3 hours of my life,
Mhm.
and technically 6 hours of my life because I watched it twice. It's a camera crew that follow the police throughout the entire course of the investigation. So it's pretty much first-person evidence of the whole thing. So in this case, I don't think you can get a better source than from the old proverbial horse's mouth, you know what I'm saying?
Courtney Valentine-Brown was a 36-year-old man living in a rented flat on Roots Hall Drive in Southend-on-Sea. The police were called to his residence following several reports of a disturbance on the 21st of February 2019, shortly before midnight. When they got there, they found a gruesome scene and an unresponsive Courtney who was badly injured. The flat was in a state of disarray, with blood smears and splatters all over the walls and toppled furniture, as well as a broken hob in the kitchen. The police and paramedics tried to tend to his injuries, but Courtney sadly passed away at 1:20 a.m. So now I'm going to ask you about the state of...
Oh God, straight in there. And that's all I have.
No, I have more. I just for once thought about asking you before getting to all of the other stuff. So what was the state of Courtney's body?
So like you said, there was blood found all over the walls, all over the sofa. They also found blood on the washing machine in the kitchen, which was a separate room. Paramedics were called to the scene. They performed emergency first aid and Courtney was taken to hospital. As a verbatim quote, he was losing blood as fast as they could replenish it. So he would have been having blood transfusions to try and pump in as much blood as possible to get him back to his normal level, but he was just bleeding that out straight away. And unfortunately, they couldn't arrest the bleeding in time to be able to save him, so he went into cardiac arrest and passed away.
Didn't they cut an artery in the thigh?
The pathologist found that the cause of death was a stab wound to the right thigh. They noted that the blade had passed all the way through the front of the thigh, and there was an exit wound at the back of the thigh.
That's one hell of a blade. That's like a machete.
And it gets worse.
It gets worse? Oh no. Oh no.
So there was a 2.5 centimeter entry wound at the front of the thigh. They also found that there was a lot of muscle damage inside of the thigh, and the exit wound was almost 180 degrees in comparison to the entry wound. So what they determined from that is that whilst the suspect was plunging the knife, they were also twisting it.
Oh no. Oh, that's so gruesome.
So they'd
God.
almost turned the blade, but it would have been 90 degrees rather than 180. I think that was a misquote from the police officers. Like you said, they severed Courtney's femoral artery. Femoral artery, that's the one that supplies all of the blood flow to your legs. So from that evidence, the pathologist determined that the blade was at least 17 centimeters long. They managed to determine that from the depth of Courtney's thigh. So it was at least 17. It could be longer. They thought that it probably was longer because there were no hilt mark bruising that you would expect to see from the handle of the blade. So if you stab someone quite aggressively and cause that kind of rupturing to major blood vessels, you would expect to see the bruising from the handle of the blade on the front of the thigh. But there was none of that evident at all. So it was at least 17 centimeters, but most likely bigger than that. They also found that he'd suffered quite a severe head wound that was attributed to blunt force trauma. They also found significant defense wounds on Courtney's person. So both of his arms had cut marks on them consistent with a knife attack, and his right index finger was almost severed. That implied to the investigating officers that he'd grabbed the blade. He would have grabbed the knife blade side to try and defer any kind of attack, and it almost cut his finger off.
Oh, God.
He was subject to quite a sustained and brutal attack.
Yeah. So the police interviewed Courtney's neighbors, and they told the police that they had seen Courtney's landlord, 31-year-old Kelly King, entering Courtney's flat the same night, accompanied by 3 men carrying knives and a baseball bat. One of the neighbors said that she had heard a lot of crashing after Kelly and her gaggle of ruffians had entered Courtney's flat.
Can we talk about the old lady?
Mm-hmm.
So police officers did a door-to-door knocking to try and find out if any of the other flat residents had heard any kind of disturbance. So they visited the lady that lived underneath the flat in question. Bless her, she was a just turned 90-year-old lady.
Oh.
She still had her birthday balloons, and they were like, "Have you just turned 90?" And this lady was like, What? Turned around. She was like, oh yes, I've just turned 90. Not sure how reliable you're going to be, my dear. They asked her if she'd heard any disturbance from the night before. So she said, this is a quote verbatim, it was like 2 Japanese wrestlers coming through the ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
The interview went back and forth. And then she clearly had no idea what had happened. She just heard this banging.
Yeah.
And then she said, it was like someone was committing murder up there.
Oh no.
Oh, bitch, we should put you on the investigation team. Just wanted to put her out there because I loved that old lady. I thought she was great.
Yeah.
There was one point where she was considering hitting the ceiling with a broom. Keep the noise down. My cats are trying to sleep.
Oh no. Okay. So after getting this information, the police found Kelly King at the home of a man named Ian Slater, who they suspected had been one of the men who had accompanied Kelly based on eyewitness testimony. Kelly was then taken to the police station and interrogated, but she withheld any information and only answered the questions with no comment. The police didn't have a choice but to release her on bail, as they couldn't formally charge her of the crime due to lack of evidence. 50-year-old Ian Slater from Lee-on-Sea surrendered himself to police, and he was arrested on suspicion of murder on the 24th of February.
3 days after the crime.
Yeah, why did he surrender himself?
The theory, and the documentary did put a bit of emphasis on this, they were contacting his known associates and basically putting the pressure on Ian to know that he was being looked for by the police. So he would have had no doubt in his mind that the police knew that he was involved in some way and they wanted to speak to him.
Okay.
And because, in his opinion, he wasn't guilty of the murder, because he didn't deal the final blow that caused Courtney to lose his life, he probably thought that if he went into the station, gave this evidence that he was going to give, and gave it willingly, he wouldn't be involved with the prosecution, is my thoughts behind why he turned himself in.
Okay. So Ian then gave the police the name of his accomplice, Alex Stevens.
He sang like a canary.
Mm-hmm.
Police asked a question, he gave them an answer with loads of detail. He says that the intention was for them to go to Kelly's flat where Courtney is staying and throw him and his drug associates out. And so Ian, in his interview, said that he needed someone to come with him as backup. So he was going to take the pit bull, as he called him. So the police officers were like, who do you mean by the pit bull? And he said, Alex Stevens. They ran the name Alex Stevens in the police database, and they got 16 pages of police records against Alex Stevens. Drug possession, drug dealing, possession of dangerous weapons, GBH, affray.
What is GBH?
Grievous bodily harm.
Oh my God, why isn't he in prison?
He has been in and out. GBH generally doesn't get a very long term. Depends on if the GBH is with a dangerous weapon, which will get a longer sentence than GBH just with fisticuffs. He had a massive rap sheet and was also imprisoned previously for, I think, manslaughter.
Why isn't he in prison?
It's probably because he's so pretty.
You see, though, I saw the photo.
I saw the mugshots. They don't do him justice, I'll be honest.
Okay, you find him attractive. All right.
He's a handsome guy. I will give him that. During Ian's interview, he also said, and quote, it was supposed to be verbal.
Mm-hmm. It's not believable because they did carry weapons going in there.
They did. So after Ian had given that interview, there was a call to the General 101 non-emergency police line, and a couple of people had been reporting that there were drug deals happening in their local area that they wanted the police to investigate. And they gave a location for those drug deals. And when the police searched that location, they found that one of the homes in that area was registered to a Mr. Alex Stevens. So they raided it. So given that Alex had quite an extensive rap sheet, they obviously went in all guns blazing, kicked down the door, found Alex trying to run away in the back garden, immediately arrested Alex. So obviously, as a known drug dealer, Alex had multiple phones. Eventually, they seized 15 from his flat. Police officers obviously searched the house, collected all of the evidence on a bed, and one of the officers was like, well, there's a white flip phone that's gone missing. Where's the white flip phone? Alex has been taken away at this point, so it's just a girlfriend in the flat. They searched her bags, and she was like, I haven't got anything on me. You've already searched me. Oh, fucking hell. And they were like, no, we haven't searched you. We've searched your bags. What's that in your pocket? It looks like a mobile phone. She's like, I haven't got a mobile phone in my pocket. It's my fags. Oh, there was a mobile phone in my pocket. Sorry. And they were like, that's not the white flip phone. Where is it? We're missing it. If it doesn't turn up, we're going to have to do a strip search on you. She was like, what, on me? I haven't got it. It's not on me. They searched all of her pockets, all of her bags, all of her possessions, and couldn't find this white phone that the officer was adamant that he'd seen. So she was sitting down on the sofa just as they were considering what to do. And then the phone started ringing.
No.
She was like, oh, it was in my pocket this whole time. It's not my fault you didn't find it. Which I just thought was hilarious. I really enjoyed that. Made me laugh out loud. They do 3 interviews with Alex, and as per his legal advice, he remains completely silent. They did get a little bit of a breakthrough. So Alex asks if he can make a phone call. I presume he calls his brother, but the call is made via speakerphone so that the officers can all hear. And one of the sentences that raises officers' suspicions is, have you been round mum's yet? So then they obtained a warrant to be able to search Alex's parents' address, and they seized a hoodie that showed dark spatters, which could possibly be blood, but they couldn't test it presumptively because that would have destroyed the evidence. A pair of trainers, which did test positive for blood, and a baseball bat. If you remember, Courtney suffered a blunt force trauma to the head, which would have been conducive with a baseball bat.
There we have it.
So when Alex was arrested, they seized a backpack, and in Ian Slater's interviews with the police, he said that Alex had a rucksack with him that he used to put the weapon back into. When they recovered that rucksack, they found blood inside the bag and 2 mobile phones with blood on them. When they looked at the cell mast data, they found that Alex's phone was pinging a cell mast all day in one location, a couple of 100 meters away from his home. So they knew that he'd been there for about 12 hours. The next activation they got was at 23:35 p.m., which was at the mast pointing towards the crime scene. The way that they know that it's pointing towards somewhere is that that phone mast will show you at which direction it's sent data into.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel it worth pointing out that the offence occurred at 23:53. So they already had some evidence to show that Alex had been in the vicinity of the crime scene, but it wasn't yet enough to be able to charge him. They still didn't have the murder weapon, and they still didn't have anything to link him to being in that location. So they went back to Ian. In one of Ian's interviews, Ian said that Alex had brought along an associate, and Ian only knew him as Fatty.
Wow.
So Ian had been brought along by Kelly as Muscle, Ian had brought along Alex as muscle, and Alex had brought along Fatty as muscle.
Oh, yeah.
Now, at this point, the police get a big old piece of juicy luck. So in the UK, there's a TV program called Crime Stoppers. Don't know if you're aware of it.
I've never seen it, but I know about it.
It's essentially a TV program that talks about serious crimes that have occurred and all of the evidence that's available to the police. So this case would have been included on the episode. They would have said, anybody with any information, call the police. So a member of the public calls in and identifies Fatty as a Mr. Stuart Pearson. So that coincided with the evidence that they had already. That was that 4 people had entered the flat. Ian was positively identified. Kelly was positively identified.
Yeah.
Ian identified Alex, and the 4th person was identified by an eyewitness as Stuart. So they went to the house that Stuart was registered as living at, and lo and behold, Stuart was there. So they arrested him on suspicion of murder. While he was being interviewed, he admitted to meeting up with Alex on the day of the murder, but denied all involvement of the crime. Said that he'd met him at about 8 or 9 p.m, that Alex had taken his phone, had gone off to secure some cocaine, and then come back and given Stuart his phone back. Police officers were like, nah, Alex has got 20 phones. This ain't happening.
You don't give someone your phone. That's just common sense.
Stuart Pearson obviously knew that the police were going to check phone records and locations and things like that. So he tried to come up with a reason why he wouldn't be associated. But his phone records showed that he was at home between 6 p.m. and 11:23 p.m. And then at 11:34, his phone was activating the same mast that Alex's phone was activating at the time of the crime. So Alex's phone was activating at 11:35 and Pearson's phone was activating at 11:34. Both phones were active and pinging at the mast by the crime scene, pointing towards the crime scene. They then saw that pretty much immediately after the offence, both phones were activating the same original masts. So they'd both gone from home, crime scene, and then back to their respective homes. When they did a little more investigation into Pearson's house, they found a knife. So the knife that they found was approximately 24 centimeters in length. The wound was at least caused by a 17 centimeter blade, so it matches in that criteria. But they also found it in a pile of burnt debris. They'd set a fire and chucked the knife in it because they knew that was the murder weapon. The knife was sent for profiling, and the officers were actually quite optimistic. They thought that once they got past all of the sooty carbon deposits, they might still be able to recover some DNA or some blood. Unfortunately, they couldn't. However, a bit further digging into the mobile numbers of both Kelly King and Ian Slater, they did find some ominous text messages exchanged between the two. So Kelly sends to Ian the message, "Final straw, had enough, just kicked off, they better watch this fucking space, I ain't playing games either." To which Ian replies, "No messing, collect any knives or nasties that you can without them seeing."
Ooh.
Now, the police officers had 2 theories as to what those messages could mean. The first theory, and this is the one that I believe, So Ian Slater has given Kelly the instruction to remove any knives or nasties, as he put it, I assume any other kind of weapon that Courtney could use in his defense when they go and attack him. The second theory is that Ian is instructing Kelly to get any knives that are currently in the flat for them to use as weapons. And I find that less believable because everybody's got a kitchen knife.
Yeah.
And then a little bit further digging into the text messages, and they can see that between Kelly, Ian, Stuart, and Alex, there are multiple messages that are detailing the attack. So they've plotted it, and it's premeditated kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty much all I have, other than the sentencing.
Okay. So Ian Slater, Alex Stevens, and Stuart Pearson were charged with the murder of Courtney in March. And in April, police arrested Kelly King as well on the charge of murder. So when the trial started, the events were described as such. Kelly King claimed that she had wanted to evict Courtney because of an argument about debt. She had then asked Slater, who was her partner, to help her get Courtney to move out. So they had then recruited Stevens and Pearson to come with, and the four of them had gone to Courtney's flat armed. Things had, surprise, surprise, turned violent.
It was definitely premeditated attack, but I think it's ambiguous to say that the four of them attended armed when only two of them were armed.
Yeah, the whole story about him owning debt to Kelly, I'm like, did he though? I just want to say that I have a suspicion that they went there because they knew that Courtney was a drug dealer and wanted to rob him.
Yeah, given Alex's background, he probably definitely, that's a great use of English. There was probably ulterior motives for Alex getting involved, and it probably wasn't solely down to the debt. Yeah. But I do think it's important to state that it was only Alex and Stuart that were armed.
Okay.
Alex was reported as making his money from robbing drug dealers.
Yeah, I had no idea about that because I just read the articles, which were very vague.
Yeah, they were incredibly vague.
The first thing that came into my mind was that this was not a
Get rid
debt.
of the competition.
Yeah. Okay, so on the 29th of January 2020, Ian Slater and Alex Stevens was sentenced to 26 years in prison for murder, while Stuart Pearson and Kelly King received a total sentence of 9 years for manslaughter.
Alex Stevens was charged with the murder for dealing the fatal blow. Ian Slater was charged with murder because he recruited Alex.
Okay. According to BBC News, Detective Chief Inspector Daniel Stoughton said of the criminals for 4 people to go to an address where the victim was going to leave anyway and take weapons and assault him is absolute cowardice. And tragically, Courtney lost his life. Courtney's family stated that we are heartbroken over the murder of our dear son, brother, uncle, and cousin, who was tragically taken away from us prematurely. He was ambitious, cheeky, and extremely creative with his whole future ahead of him, despite his life challenges. Yeah, so that's the case. Thank you so much for listening to Midweek Murders. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Ciao. Wow.